Welcome everyone to our monthly webinar. Um, this month we're going to be talking about improving your marriage. And before we get started, I want to preface everything that Connie and I will be talking about today with a few disclaimers. First of all, I want to just say if you are in a relationship that your spouse is, struggling with narcissistic tendencies or abusive tendencies or things like that, your situation is quite a bit more complicated than what we're going to be covering today. And if you're in that kind of situation, I would recommend that you seek more professional help from counselors and agencies that directly focus on that kind of situation. But today we're going to be mostly addressing marriages where, you were in love, you got married, and then with the day-to-day things that happen, you know, our bad habits or maybe some of our mindsets that we had creep in there, and we start to maybe not treat each other the way that we should. And, um, you know, over time we can become ambivalent, or we can become distant and not really utilize and use the tools that we have, or maybe we don't even know what those tools are. Maybe we were never modeled what a good marriage was. I know that for Connie and I, that was our situation. We weren't really modeled what a good marriage was. And so I know that when I came into my marriage with my husband, I brought a lot of that junk with me. And over these past couple years, God's really been challenging me in a lot of areas regarding my marriage. And I know that when I started sharing some of these concepts with Connie, they really struck a chord. And I know that Connie and I have both been on, quite an inner journey of seeking more wisdom into our own, how we contribute to the negativity and the toxicity in our own marriages. And I think in any situation, if we're always looking at the other person and what they're doing wrong and not looking within, then that's part of our problem. And so I just want to preface everything that we say today with those two things, because when you consider what we want to share today through those lenses, I think it will really make a lot of sense. And if you can take hold of some of these principles, these biblical principles, and some of these strategies that Connie and I have started to implement and see some real fruit with, it can really change and transform your marriage. So the first thing I want to bring up is the fact that, we all know that marriage was God's idea. And it's so important to him that he even has modeled the whole church around the concept of, a bride and the groom and a marriage. And when we think of the significance of that, I think it's really important that we slow down and we start to, really consider what our relationships are with our spouses. Because if they're not thriving, if there's a lot of strife and contention and difficulty, then I believe that there's room for us to grow. There's room for us to, maybe heal from some stuff in our past, and really learn some godly strategies of how to honor one another, how to walk in love. And many times we don't know what that looks like. And I also wanted to bring up the fact that, in our today culture, it's so prevalent that, well, why do I even need to get married? Right? Or maybe I can have multiple relationships, or, I know myself better than anyone else, so maybe I'll just stay single for the rest of my life. But there's something so powerful and unique that comes from having an intimate marriage relationship with someone that, when we partner with God in that, it becomes something so incredible and so beautiful. So I'm gonna tell you the book that really challenged me. Um, it was how it's called How to Properly Care and Feed Your Husband by, oh great, I forgot her name. Connie, what's her name?
I
Laura
forgot too.
Schlesinger. And honestly, I wasn't searching for this. I had actually entered a journey, a 21-day prayer journey for my husband and our marriage. And every day as I was praying, there was these prayer points that you had to pray through. And each day Well, when I started that prayer journey, my prayers were all about, Lord, change my husband. Lord, change my husband. And as I kept going through this 21 days, God slowly started working on my heart, and it became less of, Lord, change my husband, and Lord, let us work together in unity. And by the end of it, it was, Lord, change me, right? My focus then really shifted to, how have I contributed to a poor marriage, right? And my husband and I have been married for 21 years. We know beyond any shadow of a doubt that God brought us together, that we're to be married. But I can tell you honestly, we have had so many struggles. And after now having what I've learned and what I've started to implement into our relationship, I'm seeing how so many of our challenges could have been avoided. We could have come through a lot of the struggles that we had so much quicker had I known some of the things that I know now. And I believed that I was a good wife. I believed that I was a good support to my husband. What I didn't realize was a lot of the mindsets that I had, a lot of the ways that I perceived how a relationship should be were really based out of cultural norms, things that we would which I have now come to know are actually birthed out of the feminist movement, right? Like we can be independent. We don't need our men, all of those kind of things, right? And those were driving forces in my personal marriage, and it was so destructive and caused a lot of trouble. So in this book by Laura Schlesinger, it's a it's an incredible book. I only recommend you read it if you are willing to have someone be so brutally blunt to you and say it as it is and not color code it. And I'll be honest with you, when I first started reading the book, I was just like, "Oh my gosh, these women are awful. How could they possibly treat their men that way?" And by the time I got to chapter 2 or 3, that voice in my head started to become silent, because then I was like, "Wait a minute, I do that. Wait a minute, I think that way. That's how I, operate in our marriage." And I started realizing from my husband's point of view what he was feeling, what he was going through. And so that there's three main things she teaches in that book. And that or there's one thing she teaches in that book is that men have three very basic needs. And if we fulfill those needs in them, they will literally, you know, put their life on the line to meet your needs. It's almost like that, you know, the prince rescuing the princess. It's that kind of mindset, right? So when we put, you know, our men in the place that God intended them to be, then they will just naturally step into that God-given role that they have. And so the three needs that she discussed in her book, the first one is that men need to be shown appreciation and to be validated for all the hard work they do. Now, I know that we can all rationalize, yeah, well, they go and work hard, but so do I. I need the affirmation and validation too, right? And I know for me, for many years, that's what held me back from really acknowledging all the work that my husband does, right? Because I was like, he doesn't come home and acknowledge that I've been up before he got up and I work till far beyond he goes to bed, right? Um, but this is an essential need that our men have. And so, when they come in the door, for us to be thankful that they're there, appreciate that they're there. Because how many times do they come home and we're like, "Oh, you're home now?" Like, we're completely oblivious to them even being there. We're uninterested in how their day went, all of those kind of things. So that plays a huge part in what men need. The second one was serving them by providing for their needs or desires. And this can include anything from cooking meals, cleaning up after them, doing their laundry, doing a task that maybe they find menial or frustrating, just serving them in any way that would be a blessing to them. And the third one, which was hard for me personally, is initiating physical intimacy, right? Because a lot of times I'd be like, he hasn't met any of my needs, so I don't feel drawn to him in that way, right? But through this process, I've realized how important it is to have that physical connection with him. Connie, is there anything you wanted to say about this?
There's a few things I wanted to say, and that is like Laura told me about this book, and when she first told me, I started laughing because the title is like so weird. And I was like, why are you reading this book? And she was like, because I want to improve my marriage. I want to be a better wife. And I was like, okay, just seems really weird. And then like week after week, she'd tell me about what she'd been reading, and I started getting convicted myself. And so then I was like, hey, after you're done with that book, I need to read it. And she was like, okay. And so then when I read it, I was like, oh man. And the thing is I didn't think there was anything wrong with my marriage. There were so many people that kept telling me, oh, you have such an amazing marriage. You have such an amazing marriage. And that I was literally in this la la land of, oh, I have a great marriage. I don't have to worry about this. But in reality, there are things about myself, like Laura said, that we got from the example of our mom and our dad that are unhealthy mindsets to be in marriage with. And so it was really why like eye-opening for me to see what had filtered through into my marriage from all of that and from what society teaches us. And so for me, like I'm thankful that Laura was willing to share that with me, even though I had a really not necessarily great reaction in the beginning. But yeah, I'm glad that she shared it because it made it so that I would actually pursue it. And through it, like I have seen how implementing these three things have shifted things in my home and have shifted things in my relationship with my husband. And it's it's really true. Like if you step into these things, the response is amazing. Like I'll give you an example. My husband loves to cook, but he hates to clean up after cooking. And so for a while there, he was carrying it all because I was the only one working. And then he started working and nothing changed. And so I was like, well, something needs to change. I started reading this book. I'm like, something needs to change because we're both working now. And so I started doing all the cleanup after we ate and like cleaning up the house and doing like taking things off his plate. And he was so in awe that he like anything I wanted, anything I asked for, he was right there. Anything I even like could contemplate wanting, it was like he actually anticipated what I wanted. And I was like, where did this come from? He's never done this in the entire span of our marriage. And it was just so cool to see how by just implementing these three things, like all of a sudden it was like this guy I was like blown away by because it was more than I ever expected. And like the book tells you, you'll see a change, but I didn't expect it to be that dramatic. And I'm so happy with where we are now. We are in a much healthier place now. And I'm not perfect. I still sometimes slip into my old stuff and have to go, no, no, Connie, don't go there, and have to reshift things. But yeah, I have seen how doing these three things have shifted things huge for me.
Yeah, same for me too. I think the hardest part though is making those shifts, right? Because I mean, for 40 something years, we've had a certain default, right? And so it's like, catching yourself and being like, "Oh, that did not go well. I this is why," recognizing. So if this seems like, you know, too good to be true and you want to learn more because there's so much to this subject of marriage, we can't possibly cover it all in one webinar. If this is an area where you really are wanting to know more and wanting to maybe have a greater understanding about this, I do recommend this book. She doesn't hold anything back, so be prepared. But for me and Connie, it has been life transformational, and I can't say anything more about it. So, yeah, we can move on from that, Connie. Another major point I want to bring up to us ladies today is that God actually created us, the women, to be the keeper of our home, right? Because we might say, okay, well, we know what the man's role is. You know, the Bible's clear on that, but what is the woman's role in a marriage, right? Well, he's created us to be the keeper of our home, and we get to set the tone, and where our mind and heart goes, our household and our marriage tend to follow. And I've found this to be true, right? If my thoughts and my heart are, negative towards my husband or negative towards my situation, like that is the atmosphere and that's the tone in our home. But if I, have that spirit of affirmation or encouragement or comfort or all of those things, that just automatically manifests in our home. And so you as the woman, you get to choose what your home atmosphere will be like. And of course, there will be things that come in, but in the moment, you can shift those atmospheres. And even one scripture comes to mind right now, which says, a gentle word turns away wrath, right? So even if your husband's like on edge, had a rough day, is coming at you, you know, just taking shots, you have the opportunity in that moment to completely neutralize that whole situation instead of, joining in on that. So you get to be the gatekeeper for your home. Two really great scriptures I wanted to bring up is Proverbs 14:1. And the woman builds her house, but with her own hands the foolish one tears hers down. And when I look back on my marriage, I see so many times with my own words, with my own actions, I have built up my home, but other times I've been the catalyst for tearing it apart, for causing so much strife, causing so much discord and harm to my husband, to our family unit, even sometimes to my children, right? And so us as women, we have to be mindful that as the bearers and the keepers of our home, that we have the ability to build that up or to tear it down. Another scripture I've always found kind of humorous, but when you think about it, like Proverbs 21:9 says, it's better to live on a corner of a roof than to share a house with a quarrelsome wife, right? And I think back to sometimes when my husband and I have been in like some serious arguments and periods of strife, like, he wants to be the farthest thing away from me, right? And this scripture, explains so clearly why, right? Nobody wants to be around someone who's being quarrelsome and just picking fights and needing and demanding their own way, right? Connie, do you want to share about this one?
Sure. Ecclesiastes 4:9-7 says, two are better than one, because they have a good return for their work. If one falls down, his friend can help him up. Also, if two lie down together, they will keep warm. But how can they keep warm alone? Though one may be overpowered, two can defend themselves. A cord of 3 strands is not easily broken. And I think when we hear this, a lot of times we like get to the point of a cord of 3 strands is not easily broken. And we're like, okay, so keep God at the center of our marriage. Okay, good. But I think it's also key to like look at all the other aspects, right? Like you guys are partners in this life. You work together, you keep each other like protected and warm, and you take care of one another, you defend each other, like you do all of life together. And so it's key to like think of all of these things, right? Like, and yes, keep God at the center of your marriage, seek his counsel when dealing with difficult situations and conflict, ask him for his perspective, right? If you keep God at the center of your marriage, it will be as strong as a 3-stranded cord. And so that is an important thing, to keep God at the center. And I've seen what happens when, you let your devotional life slide a little bit and you don't pray together as much. And you pray together when there's a crisis, but not so much otherwise. I've seen what happens, because there was a time where me and my husband let that happen. And I can tell you that it was really, really hard. And so keeping God at the center changes everything. And I've seen what happens when God comes back, like when we bring God back into the center again, and how that changes things. Because it's not like we left God, it's just that we didn't necessarily pursue him together, but it makes an impact on your relationship. And I think for us, when we've been we call it being in sync. And the more that we have God at the center of the marriage, the more in sync we are. It's like all of a sudden we are on the same page. All of a sudden we finish each other's sentences without trying. Like it's those things, because all of a sudden our hearts are beating at the same pace almost. And it's just a beautiful thing. Did you want to say anything about this or move on?
Yeah, I agree with you. When Doug and I, seek the Lord together, or pray together consistently, we just naturally are on the same page, and it brings us closer together, right? And I think really important is, when you have a disagreement, when you have something that you have conflict over, it's like to take that time and seek God's counsel, right? And sometimes you do that on your own, and sometimes Doug does it on his own, and then we come together, and then we always hear the same thing, right? So we don't always seek God together. Sometimes we say, okay, we're going to pray about this, and then, in a couple days we're going to come talk about it again. And after those couple days, because at the beginning we were not in agreement, right? But then after those few days of committing it to prayer, really seeking the Lord on that issue, when we come back to talk about it, we literally have the exact same resolution or solution or answer. And it's just like, because God's going to tell us the same thing, right? And so even, seeking God in that respect, I think is also, a good point to bring up as well. So we're going to talk a bit about communication. And I loved this picture. When I saw it, I was just like, I got to use this picture, right? Because a lot of the times, especially for me, I feel like, my husband's not listening. So I feel like I'm this woman in this picture who's like trying to get her point across, and, it's not being clearly communicated, right? So how many times does that happen in our relationships, right? And, what happens when we don't feel like we're being listened to, or, we're not being heard or not being considered, right? And so, um, there's a lot of points we can talk about communication, but the first point is that men and women are so different, right? We all communicate so differently. And I found this picture and I thought, okay, this explains it perfectly, right? I think actually one of my friends, I think it might have been Sharon, actually shared it on her Facebook page. And I was just like, this is so it, right? Because even when I talk to my husband, um, you know, he just has one train of thought. Like if he's thinking about work, he's thinking about work. He's not thinking about 2 weeks from now. He's not thinking about the emotions of yesterday. Like he's just thinking about the complexities of work. Whereas there's some days where, I'm deep in thought, and he'll come to me and he'll say, "What's on your mind, honey?" And I say to him, "Oh, you don't want to know." And he's like, "Well, yeah, I do want to know." And then I start saying, "Well, I had this thought, which led to this thought, which led to this thought and this thought." And then he's like, "Okay, whoa, whoa, whoa." Right? But that's naturally how we're wired, right? And so taking this knowledge into our conversations with our husbands, I think is important, right? Because sometimes we might think, he doesn't understand me, or he's not being empathetic, or he's, ignoring me. But when we realize the fact that they can only really handle one thing at a time, then that changes the way I communicate. That changes what I decide to bring up, when I decide to bring it up, how I decide to bring it up, right? Because they're not built to have these multiple, you know, synapses and connections happening at the same time. And so I think this is a really important um, thing to consider.
I also wanted to say that men are problem solvers, right? And so we as women get used to communicating where, like, if we're with a group of women, we'll share like all sorts of details and all sorts of information with people, like with other women. And then when we go back to our marriage partner and they ask us, well, what's going on with you? We think we can tell them the same thing we tell our friends. And we can't, because they don't think the same way we do. And they're not looking for information. They're looking for a way to fix whatever's wrong. And
Right.
and so when we tell them stuff, then they're immediately going into, oh, she has a problem. Okay, I need to fix it. And so then they're listening intently with keeping track of ways they can help you fix it. And then instead of them actually getting the point or just listening to you, then they're like giving you advice, and it's unsolicited advice. And then you get frustrated and it becomes this thing, right? Well, it's because we think differently, right? And sometimes when they're sharing things with us, sometimes they can be actually looking for solutions because they do the same thing. Like they share their guy thing. And when a guy talks to a guy, typically they'll share their situation and the other guy will go, oh, well, you could do this or this, and the other guy goes, oh, that's a good idea, right? Pretty simple. But then they come home and do the same thing with us, and we're like, either we don't have enough information to actually give them anything because we're used to getting all the information, or we're just listening, like we're in listen mode, because we know that we as women need that. We need people just to listen. And so we'll just listen and then not say anything, and then they're waiting and they don't get anything. Or at least this is the way it is with my husband. And I'm like, why are you staring at me? And he's like, because you're not telling me anything. And I'm like, what am I supposed to tell you? And he's like, I just told you my problem and you're not helping me. And I'm like, I didn't know I was supposed to. I thought I was supposed to listen. And so then I'm like, and then I've also made the mistake of then telling him what to do. And then he gets mad. And I'm like, this is why I don't tell you. And he's like, no, I want ideas on what I could do, not what you think I have to do. And I was like, oh, so like we've had that issue too, right? They don't like being told what to do. They like being told what they could do so that they can make that choice. So this is something I've learned over time, right? And so now when he's sharing something and I hear that there's a problem in there that I'm listening for, I now go, well, you could do this or you could do that. But ultimately, it's up to you what you decide to do. And he just goes, oh, those are good ideas. I will think about that. And then I'm like, ultimately, you should also take it to the Lord. And so then we're including the third member of our relationship, right? So that's my feedback on that part.
Awesome. So when dealing with communication, there's lots of things that you can do to really set yourself up for success, but these are just a few of the you know, most pertinent points that I've had to adopt into my life, and I'm sure Connie has too. But the first one is, and you might not think like, why should I schedule time to communicate, right? But I'll be honest with you, we live busy lives. We work, we have children, we have other commitments, whether our kids are on sports teams or whatever. We're drawn in so many directions. And how many times do are we like ships passing in the night, right? And so to have a dedicated date night or have a dedicated time where it's just like you kind of just debrief the week and you bring up any concerns or worries or things that are happening, you talk about what happened that week, or bring up needs, bring up things that need to be addressed, issues or things that you need, decisions that you guys need to make as a couple, and make sure that this time is distraction free. There's nothing worse than trying to have a conversation with somebody and their like phone is just blowing up. They're constantly distracted by text messages coming in or emails that they're now replying to, or children that are interrupting with some kind of sibling rivalry or something else that they want from you in that instant. And, you're tempted to just drop everything and go tend to that need, right? So schedule distraction free time to just communicate, to just have conversation. Because, before you got married, or at least I'll speak for myself, before we got married, before we had children, like, we had the communication time every day, right? And, over time, you lose that, right? So you lose that sense of connection, that sense of being able to really talk through things, right? Because when you're on the fly and you need an instant decision and, emotions are high and people are already stirred up from something else, like that doesn't work. That always ends up in failure in my marriage, and I'm sure it does for yours too. Another point I wanted to make was pay attention to what each other is saying. How many times do we listen to what they're saying, but in our heads we're thinking, okay, this is how I'm going to respond, right? I do it all the time. I'm not actually listening to what they're saying to understand, right? And I think when it comes to communicating with our spouses, that is so important because they don't always want your rebuttal. They don't always want your, telling them what to do. Like sometimes they want you to understand where they're coming from, right? And it's in that process of coming to a place of understanding why they're saying those things, why they're feeling that way, why they're coming from that place, then that changes how I respond, right? So instead of, for example, my husband coming to me and saying, when you did this, it made me feel hurt, or it made me feel rejected, or it made me feel disrespected, right? Instead of me hearing those words and thinking of like, well, you did this, this, and this, and this to me, right? Instead of listening to understand why he felt disrespected, right? Maybe I cut him off. Maybe I didn't listen to what he said. Maybe I put him down in front of the kids, right? All of those are legitimate, right? So I actually have to hear what he's saying, understand it so that I can actually be like, you know what, honey, you're right. I I did disrespect you in front of the kids. I am so sorry for that. I will be more mindful of that in the future instead of getting my defenses up and then engaging in a whole blow up of an argument, right?
And sometimes when you're like seeking to understand, if you're really not following what they're saying or they've lost you somewhere, ask questions because they'd rather answer your questions than you not fully understand where they're at.
Yeah. Yeah, and then there being an argument because you misunderstood, right?
Mhm.
And how many times do you kind of go through that point where it's like, "No, that's not what I said. That's not what I meant," right? That happens a lot, right? Another point I want to bring up is men cannot read our minds. So we need to actually share with them what we're thinking, hoping for, expecting. For for years, I was just like, if my husband knows me, we've been married for 18, 19 years, he should know me by now. He should know that this is what I want. This is how I want it. This is all of these things. He doesn't know, right? Like, so I need to tell him, right? And then sometimes he actually says, "Laura, what do you want to do for your birthday? Or what do you want? What do you want?" They want to give us what we need. They want to give us what we want. And a lot of times when Doug comes to me, I actually say, "Oh, I don't know." But at the heart of the matter, it's you should already know, so I'm not going to tell you, right? But then we're both miserable. We're both unhappy. Whereas if I could just say, "Hey, well, actually today I feel like I just want to go for a walk in the park," right? Then he would be like, "Let's go. Let's get in the car right now and let's go," right? Whereas if it's just like, "Oh, I don't know what I want to do on our date night," then he gets frustrated and then it like just goes downhill from there, right? So we have to be able to actually communicate what we're thinking, what we're feeling, what we need. So yeah, some conflict strategies. The first one here is huge, and Laura Schlesinger talks a lot about this in her book. Um, but it's, when we are bringing up conversations, especially things that are difficult to talk about, to make sure that we have made no accusations or criticism towards our spouse, even if they've done something that isn't ideal or has caused an issue, right? What I like to say to that is actually, if you have to talk about something difficult, actually come first with some form of praise or some kind of encouragement and say, "You know what? I really appreciate all of the hard work that you've been doing, honey. It's really made my life simple. It's really brought a lot of joy and peace to our home. But I just want to bring up one concern or one idea that I have. And then he's completely diffused. Like he doesn't have his defenses up. He's not ready to go on combat. Like he's ready to hear what it is that I have to say. And so once you come with that spirit, you're able to then share honestly from your heart how, you know, what you're thinking about something, or maybe how something that they did made you feel. And then you can make suggestions about how they could maybe make changes in the future, how they could maybe handle that situation differently. Connie, you can use the I feel statements. That one you use a lot. You were talking about that one earlier today.
Yeah. I me and Walter use the I feel statements a lot because in the beginning of our marriage, it was a lot of accusations, like Laura was saying earlier. And it was a lot of, well, you made me feel this way, and well, this happened because of this that you did. And it was a lot of blaming. And when we shifted into, I feel this way because of this, it really changed the adversarial aspect of our conflicts into conversations instead of a discussion, instead of a battle. And we actually made way more progress and had way shorter arguments because of the I feel statements, because you're not defensive with one another. You're just actually listening to why they feel the way that they feel and trying to understand how you had a part to play in that, right? And because of that, I feel like it's really shifted the way that we speak to one another, we think, and like our conflicts are resolved much quicker. What used to take 6-7 hours now takes 1. So it's dramatically different. And when you start using those I feel statements also, it's like it takes you to a rational place, because you have to, when you're angry, your emotions are sky high, and your arguments go to the irrational places of you never do this, or you always do this, and this is always the result. And the always and the never statements tell you that you're in an irrational place. So that's when we're like, whoa. We've gone to this place. We need to go back to our I feel statements. And then as soon as we start really thinking about what we feel and why, what triggered us, it shifts us back to that rational place, because our emotions come back down. And we can actually then have a rational conversation and deal with the actual problems. And sometimes it's not even about what's going on in the moment. Sometimes it's about something totally unrelated, but something in the moment triggered it.
Right. I also like to point out that I've learned to prioritize my relationship over being right. And what I mean by that is there's times when Doug comes with me with an issue, and I know that what I'm sharing with him is correct, but it's causing conflict. I have come to the place where I'd rather preserve peace in our relationship than prove my point. And so I'm willing to say, you know what? I understand where you're coming from. You know, these are some of my thoughts, but at the end of the day, you get to decide, and I'll support you whatever you decide, right? Even though I know in my heart that what I'm saying is true, I give it back to him and I just say, you know what? I value our relationship. I value you more than I value being right. Whereas in the past, I would fight to the death. I'd be like, no, we're not doing this. It has to be done this way, because if we do it your way, these are going to be the consequences. And so essentially what I'm communicating to him is, you know, you're incapable, you're not effective, you're a failure. All of these things are being communicated by me having that stance. Whereas when I say, you know, these are my concerns, These are my thoughts about that, but I trust you, and whatever you decide, I'll support. Then, he has all the information laid out on the table, and he gets to make that decision, and I have to stick by my word. Even if he chose the decision, which I know would have a negative consequence, I still choose to support him in that, even though inside I'm like, "God, if only," right? But that's an issue that I work out with God and myself. But to him, I'm just like, "You know what? Well, I'm sorry that that happened, but we're gonna work it out. We're gonna figure it out. We're gonna get through this," right? Because I value our relationship more than I value being right. Another one that I've heard this years ago, but I rarely ever put it into effect. But I think it's important, right? Because if you're entering into any kind of communication or any kind of conflict, and you are hungry, angry, lonely, or tired, I tell you to stop right there. Because if you are any of those things, it's not going to go well. It's going to accelerate. It's going to go down a bad path. And that's why the acronym is called HALT, right? So there's some days where it's just like Doug and I are both at our limit. We've both had a bad day. We're both feeling super stressed about things. And I'm just like, we're not having this conversation right now. We're both not in the right headspace. Let's come back, in 12 hours, or maybe tomorrow, or maybe in a couple days when we've had time to like get some sleep, get some food in us, have some time to pray, right? Because if you're depleted in any of those areas, it's going to just cause it to go awry immediately.
Um,
And, oh, go ahead, Connie.
uh, in regards to that, there's a scripture that says, don't go to bed angry with your spouse or whatever. Like, don't go to bed angry. And so one night, me and Walter were like fighting, and it's 3 o'clock in the morning, and we were so tired, and we were going around in circles. We weren't getting anywhere. And I'm like, "Are you angry?" He's like, "No." And he's like, "Are you angry?" And I'm like, "No." And we're like, "Okay, can we pause this till tomorrow so we can sleep?" Because we'd been fighting for 4 hours. And I'm like, "Yes." So we went to sleep, and the next morning we resolved it in 10 minutes. So what Laura just said is so true. Like, you need to resolve like whatever the issue is, whether you're hungry, angry, lonely, or tired, in order to have that conversation and be able to wrap it up.
Yeah. And oftentimes during that period, like, I take that time to go talk to God,
Mm-hmm.
right? And sometimes Doug will say, "Are you okay?" And I'm like, "No, I'm not okay right now, but I will be. I just need some time alone with God," right? Because, whatever I wasn't getting in that moment, or whatever I needed that didn't happen, or whatever perspective even that I needed shifting, I can't do any of that on my own, right? And, God is my source. And so when I go to God, maybe He gives me the encouragement I need, or He gives me the wisdom that I need in that situation. But every single time that I've had to say, I can't talk about this right now, I really need to retreat and take some time to think about this, pray about it, get my composure, I would say God's always shifted my perspective. He's always allowed me to see more about the situation than I knew previously, or he's changed the way I feel about it, right? He's taken away the sting, or he's taken away the hurt. Um, and I've been able to walk in forgiveness, or I've been able to understand where Doug's coming from, and come to a really safe place when I come back in conversation. And a lot of times it's resolved and we don't really have to even talk about it, right? Because I was able to resolve it with God.
I feel like there's times when um we sometimes can't even put into words what's really going on, or we don't really know.
Right.
And so actually taking that time with God helps us to find out where we are and why we got triggered, in order for us to even have a conversation about it. Because there's been a few times where we had no idea why we got angry. It doesn't make any sense to either of us. And the
Right.
emotions have come down, and we're just like, I honestly don't know. And so then we take
Mhm.
that time with God, and then we come back and we can actually share why we got triggered, because sometimes it's something that we don't even realize about ourselves that we're going through. And it may like, so it actually takes me into the next thing, which I call the tile strategy. It kind of sounds funny, but me and Walter have used it and it works. We have a towel that hangs in our kitchen, and it hangs literally on a little dowel that has a board behind it and a little heart. And whenever we have a fight where we're actually not getting anywhere and we've stopped listening to each other, we'll grab the towel and we'll give the other person space to talk. And how it works is simply this: one person, whoever gets the towel first, and you can use any object, or you can even use a safe word, and then whoever says the safe word can start. But the whole point is that one person starts, whether it's the person with the object or the person who started, and the other person listens, like actively listens to what the other person is saying. And like Laura was saying, you listen with the intent to mirror back what they're saying, not to respond, because when our emotions are heightened and everything, we want to go, oh, I know how I'm going to talk about that point, and oh, I know how to talk about that point. But in this strategy, you're listening for what they're actually feeling. And in this one, you use your I feel statements. There's no accusations. And you like really listen to be heard, or like listen to understand, I mean. And you mirror back what you've heard once they've done. And you do one point at a time, because otherwise it's too much for the other person to know what you actually are talking about. And then when you mirror it back, you say, is that what you were trying to say? Like, did I understand you? And then they can clarify anything that wasn't clear. And then you say, okay, was there anything else? And then they have the option to expand on that point of view. And then you would mirror that again. And then once they've been like, yeah, that's everything, then it's your turn to respond. And they mirror back what you've said. And you go back and forth until it's completely resolved. And it actually does take all of that anger and frustration down to a place where you can actually have this conversation and actively seek to understand each other. And the first time we used it was after we had gone to this marriage seminar, learned about it. And one day, I don't even know what I did or what I said. All of a sudden, like Walter's like yelling at me, and I kept saying, what are you mad about? And he couldn't articulate it. And I didn't know what else to do. And I was like, oh, the towel. So I go to the other room, and he got mad because I left the room. But then I came back and I threw the towel at him. And you'd think that me throwing at him would have made him more angry, but it didn't. It broke it, because he was like, she's giving me the space to actually talk about how I'm feeling, what I'm thinking. She's trying to understand. And in that moment, he started crying, because it had nothing to do with anything I said or anything I did. He was feeling guilt over us not being able to adopt his niece. And he thought it was all his fault. And so we were able to talk all of that out. And it was amazing how healing that was. So our argument wasn't even about what he was yelling about. But it took me doing that for him to sit down and go, to realize, oh, there's something else here. That's not even what I'm mad about. I'm not mad about anything, except I feel guilty. And so, like, even to see how dramatically it shifted things in that moment was shocking for me. And so we've like kept it because it works so well.
So another thing to consider is what are your and your husband's love languages? And I've found that this is a significant part of truly understanding one another and, you know, feeling understood and loved and all of those things, because my husband and I have completely different love languages, to the point where, you know, I'll sometimes feel like he doesn't love me because he spends all of his time creating things, building things, um, and giving me gifts, right? Like those are not my love language, right? And in fact, those actually take him away from what I need, which is quality time and words of affirmation, right? So he's trying to express love to me by creating some beautiful space, but all I really want and need from him is that he comes spend a few hours with me, and we have a conversation and we spend quality time together, right? And so when we're not on the same page and we don't understand this about one another, it can cause a lot of issues and a lot of conflict. And I know that this is a common common knowledge now. Like a lot of people talk about love languages. But I think sometimes it's overlooked, right? Like we know it in the back of our head, but it's another thing to apply it, or actually like look at our situation and look at our spouse and be like, okay, what way would I clearly communicate love to my husband? Right. And for my husband, it's acts of service and gifts. Right. And so, if he's working hard on our addition or on a job site or whatnot, for me to like drive to his job site and show up with a cold drink and a snack for him to eat, he just feels over the moon loved. Or if he's like working on the Bobcat and I bring him a cold bottle of water with ice and lemon, like he just feels so loved, right? Whereas for me, it's like, no, get off the Bobcat and come sit with me on the swing, right? So, um, understanding what your love languages are and clearly communicating that to your spouse, but also knowing what their love language is, and then showing them love in that way, it actually really does change things a lot in our relationships.
Another thing to mention is that we typically show our love in the ones that are the highest for us. And so realizing that your spouse may not have the same high ones as you do is important, because if you're showing love throughout yours and yours are completely opposite of your partner's, then you end up having this issue where you both feel unloved a lot of the time because you're not hitting those notes. And I found that with me and my husband, because his top one is touch, my bottom one is touch. And so for me, it's super hard. And for him, that's what he needs the most. And so for me, when I learned that, I was like, oh man, that's why I'm constantly feeling smothered by him, because he's not getting enough touch from me initiating. So he's like, just grab me all the time, hug me all the time. And I just felt completely smothered. So now when I initiate, it has actually greater impact than him touching me as much, because I've actually shown him love. It's not like he has to actively go get it. And so it's amazing. Like I'll give him a hug and it means the world. And it takes me, 30 seconds to hug him. Right. And so it's a total difference for him.
Yeah, I'll just quickly go over what the 5 love languages are for anyone who
Mm.
might be watching this and don't know what they are. So,
You're
so
right.
the 5 love languages are acts of service, and that would be doing things for a person like cleaning, helping them, doing a project with them, bringing them something. Like I said, I bring snacks and drinks to Doug. The second one is gifts. So that would be, cards, gifts, presents, something that communicates to them that you're thinking of them, you know what they like, and that you're on their heart, or they're on your heart. The third one is quality time, which could be coffee dates, meal times together, games nights, walks, conversations, just spending quality time with one another. Fourth is words of affirmation, which are praise, compliments, appreciation, showing honor. And physical touch could be kisses, hugs, hand holding, snuggling, or anything of that sort. And if you don't know what your love languages are, you can actually go online. There is a quiz. You go to 5lovelanguages.com and you can do the online quiz, and it will actually show you where your love languages rate. So that would be actually helpful for you to do with your spouse. So when Connie and I were talking about, marriage and what we should share today, the conversation came up about respect versus honor, right? Because a lot of times, there's even a book out there that says, respect, men need respect and women need love, right? Or something along those lines. And I've always had a problem with that because for me, when I think of the word respect, that communicates something that can be earned or lost, right? Because if someone was being disrespectful to me or did something inappropriate or whatnot, like my level of respect for them could decrease, right? And I don't think that was the intention. When God, says we should honor or respect our husbands in the Bible, it's not something that should be earned or that could be taken away. And so I think a more appropriate word is the word honor. And when we talk about honor, what does it actually mean to honor someone? Well, it means that you treat them well, you speak well of them, and you show them love and compassion, whether they deserve it or not. And I think that's an important distinction to make when it comes to talking about our spouses and our relationships. Because if we're going to show people honor and give them the honor that they deserve, it's not dependent on whether they did everything right, whether they said everything right, right? Like God created this person, has brought this person in my life, and I've been called to honor them. And so I just wanted to make that distinction, that because a lot of times we think, well, we need to respect our husbands. And my husband will sometimes say that to me, like, you don't respect me. And I've said to him, I think the more appropriate word is honor, because I need to honor you regardless of how I feel that you're treating me, regardless of how I feel like this whole thing has gone, right? I still need to choose honor. I still need to treat you well, right? Because just because you maybe aren't treating me well doesn't mean I can reciprocate that, right? Because then that does come across as disrespectful.
And in that way, honor is like actually a higher calling than respect is, because it requires us to humble ourselves and give this
Mm-hmm.
gift to the person, even if they don't deserve it, even if they've treated us badly. And God
Right.
gives us the same thing, right? Like he gives us grace and he gives us his mercy, and he calls us to do the same, right? And so like in honoring that, that's us humbling ourselves and giving this gift to them regardless of whether they deserve it.
Before we go on, I wanted to talk about a few things not to do. So we've already talked about some things that we should be doing, how we should be communicating, how we should be, thinking and responding and relating to our spouse. But I wanted to bring up just a few things that I recommend you never do in your marriage, because if you do, like this picture shows, it causes destruction. And the house that you are trying to build, that lifestyle and that marriage that you want, can literally be obliterated very quickly by repeated poor habits and different things. And so some of the things, and some of these might be repeat from things that we've already talked about, but I want to highlight them, is don't expect your husband to be a mind reader, because if you do, that's always going to turn out poorly. Another one is, this one's huge for me. That's why it made it on the list. But never say, never mind, I'll just do it. Right? Because, for example, my husband will be like, oh, what projects do we need to get done on the land? And then I'll give him my list. And then he'll say, okay, well, you know, that's great. I'd love to do that for you. I'll be able to do it at this time. But in my mind, I'm thinking, no, I want it done right now, or I need it done right now. Right? Then I'll say, you know what, never mind. I'll just go do it myself. Right? That communicates to him that, I don't need you. You're useless. Like you can't do anything that I asked you to do. Um, Whereas in that situation, I could have been like, you know what, honey, I appreciate that you want to do that tomorrow, but it's actually really time sensitive for me. Is it okay if we work on that project right now? Right? Maybe let's do it together, right? Or if it's not time sensitive, I could be like, you know what, Laura, you can just totally let go of your need to do that right now, and be like, okay, that would be lovely if you could do that for me tomorrow, right? Because every single time that I just do that, every time I say, never mind, I'll just do it myself, like I literally can see him being crushed. I can see his spirit like diminishing and dying within him. Like, and I don't want to be that person to be like destroying my husband because of the words or the attitudes that I have. Yeah, Connie?
Uh, one thing that popped into my head that is along those lines, but not the same, is just that, or when they're seeking to understand you and you've explained like how you feel or what you're trying to say 3 or 4 different ways and they still don't understand, don't say, never mind. It's not important. They don't like that either.
Yeah,
They are seeking to understand you and they would rather you draw a picture than say never mind. They want to
right.
know, they want to understand. They're not trying to be difficult. They're just trying to really understand you.
That's so true. And that has happened in our marriage too. Another one we've talked about already is do not criticize or complain, right? Um, and this was one of my husband's biggest complaints about me, and he's been saying it for years. But yeah, he would always say to me like, "All you do is criticize me. All you do is criticize me." And I'd say, "I don't criticize you, right?" And I didn't understand until I read Laura's book. Oh my gosh, I do criticize him, right? Because and and I'll use an example. My mind is always looking to solve problems, like similar to a man, but like for example, my husband is so creative and loves building and does all these things. Um, so when he, for example, this beautiful space that I'm in right now, he made this writing studio for me so that I could write and spend time on some of my projects that I'm working on. And he didn't want me to see the space until it was completely finished. And inside that caused me anxiety because I was like, well, no, I want to be able to say how I want it to be, right? But he really wanted to surprise me. And so it was reveal day and he let me come up here and he was so excited and he was just over the moon. He wanted to bless me. And I walked in the door and I looked at everything. And the very first thing, and I'm ashamed to say this, but the very first thing I said was, "Oh, it's great." And then I said, "Oh, but this is unfinished, and this is unfinished." And he totally just his whole demeanor sank and it's yes, that was true. Like these things were unfinished, but I should have looked and been like, "This is so incredible. Thank you so much. What you have done is just over the top. You have just blessed me so much, right?" But like my nature is to always look at what needs to be fixed, right? And so I've had to do a lot of changing in that and to always recognize the effort, recognize the what he's done, right? And so instead of criticizing or complaining like that these things weren't finished, right? To be just so thankful for what he's done, right? That was a huge lesson for me, and it wasn't until reading Laura's book that I actually realized that I had a problem, right? And for years, he would always say the same thing, and I would be so confused. I'd be like, I don't understand how, but now I see it all the time, and so I'm always catching myself. Nope, not gonna say that, right? Or all of those kind of things. So that's a really important one to keep in check and to be mindful of. And another issue is when we refuse to take responsibility for our part of the issue. Um, and this one I've been learning with greater depth lately because, I always strive to do everything well and I try not to make too many mistakes. But even in our relationship, like, even if there's been a miscommunication or a communication has gone south, I take a step back and I reevaluate like, okay, what part of that communication breakdown was I responsible for? And I've started um, to say, you know what, that didn't go well, and I personally take responsibility for these parts, right? But when you don't do that, when you don't look at a specific situation and take responsibility for yourself and you just assume that it's completely 100% the other person's problem, that is recipe for disaster. And then the last point I wanted to make was just the need to be right in everything, never compromising or seeing someone else's point of view. And that was also a really significant thing I've had to work through because, I often think that I'm right. And I have a hard time, especially when it comes to Doug, taking his perspective or considering what he has to say. And even if it doesn't align with what I desire or what I want, like when I take that when I take that stance that I need to be right, it goes disastrously.
And I think that's one that I've struggled with a lot too, is like always needing to be right. And that one was hard for me to let go too.
And I think that
Because
one was modeled a lot in our childhood, Connie, from our mom.
yeah, it was like battle to the death. And so we both picked up on that battle to the death because you're right. So
Yeah. A lot of times when we have consistent conflict in our marriages or, maybe some distance has happened, maybe your spouse has become completely disconnected and withdrawn and doesn't even want to talk to you about the issues going on. You're trying to engage all of these things. There could be the temptation to be like, you know what, this isn't worth it. Right. And sometimes, and I'll be honest with you, probably about 5 or 6 years ago, I went through a period of time where I was ready to separate from Doug because I felt that, things weren't going the way that I wanted them to be. And, every effort I was making wasn't working. And, I did give him a timeline. I said, I want these things to change by this time. And I said, I'm going to give you 6 months. And during those 6 months, God actually convicted me. God actually showed me how I was part of the problem. And, how many times do we think that if our marriage seems to be broken and in disrepair and not there's no hope for it, we sometimes get this mindset that it's easier just to separate or maybe even start over. But if I had done that, my problems would have just followed me into my next relationship. And so recognizing that, marriages are worth working on. They're worth pursuing and working hard at and and creating something that's, you know, life-giving, right? And so don't be so quick to just throw in the towel, right? Look within, ask God to show you your part and work towards honoring your spouse. Work towards, valuing them more than being right, valuing them more, keeping that connection more than, having your way. Because the alternative is not anything that I desire anyone to have to go through. And I know people who have, even Doug has had a previous marriage, and it's not easy. It's hard, it's messy. And, some of the things that he struggled with in his previous marriage, he brought into this marriage. And so we're refined, we're being refined, we're being, challenged, we're growing, we're healing, right? But that all happens within relationship.
both me and Walter have also been divorced, and I can reiterate just what Laura said. You do bring all that stuff with you, and it takes a lot to work through a lot of that stuff because that was your first experience with marriage, and so you think that's how marriage goes. And when you go to these when you learn all these things about your marriage and you start implementing them, you start seeing that no, your marriage doesn't have to be that way. It can be something better. It can be something great.
Yeah.
So the activation today is about honoring your husband. And when we've had a difficult time in our marriage, because we all have difficult times, marriage isn't perfect. Marriage has its ups and its downs. we sometimes lose sight of why we love that person to begin with. Yet there's many things that we notice about them in the beginning that we have loved. Circumstances have changed, but deep down, those things are still there. That person at their core is still the same person that we married, even if, you know, they're not treating us the same or they're not speaking to us the same way because things have gone sideways. Those things are still there. So I want to take the next 5 minutes and you can make up a list of things that you love about your husband. Then for those of you who aren't married, you can make up a list of things that you appreciate about your best friend. Because for those of us who are married, we know that our husbands in a lot of ways are our best friend because they're walking through life with us, they share life with us. And when we have great communication, we actually do have that best friend camaraderie going on. And we can either write these things on cards or notes and give them to our husbands, or we can say something that we appreciate them each day for the next few weeks until you run out of things, or maybe it'll become a habit and you'll just naturally start doing that because they need to hear it. It's part of the honoring thing. And it's a great way to create this environment that fosters honor, right? If you're having a hard time thinking of anything that would be honoring, go back to the beginning of your marriage or go back to the beginning of your relationship and remember why you wanted to marry him to begin with. Think of things like there are things that fade into the background when we face tough circumstances, but it's amazing how when we share the things that were strengths that we saw in them, or that were great things that we saw in them, even speaking them out in their life now, even if it's not evident, can call those things out in that person and it can start coming back to fruition. Because a lot of times when things start fading in us, it's not because we want them to, it's because circumstances have buried those great things about us deep down. And those things sometimes need to be called back to the forefront. And so it's amazing how when you start saying all these positive things to people, how it can start bringing those things back in their life.
As we finish up for today, there's 3 keys I want us to kind of take out away from today. And the first one is when we realize that men have really just 3 basic needs, that when they're fulfilled, they will literally do everything they can do to make sure our needs are met. It changes the whole game. And this is what Connie and I have found to be true over the last year and a bit as we've been using these strategies. Number 2, the role of a wife is to manage her household, set the tone, and create the atmosphere she desires. So that is actually a godly mantle that he's given each one of us women, and we get to decide what our atmosphere will be in our home. And in every given situation, we get to make or break that. And number 3, honor is so key. Honor one another, place each other as more important than yourself, and you will ultimately both feel valued and loved. Remember that honor is not earned. It's offered even when the other person does not deserve it. In 1 Corinthians 16:14, do everything in love. And when we think about that in context to 1 Corinthians 13, which is the love chapter, you know, love is patient, love is kind, all of those things. Those are all the things that God's calling us to in our relationship with our spouses. And just to know that even in everything that we do and say and communicate in our marriages, if it's not done in love, then it's not going to have the godly result that God desires in our marriages. Our next webinar is called Reigniting Your Passion, and that will be happening July 4th. So Connie, do you want to tell us a little bit more about what you'll be sharing on?
So for me, like, the reason I felt this on my heart that I should share this is because for me, it's, like I said, touches like really low on my my love languages. And so part of like it is like how to reignite your passion in your relationships. But then part of it is also reigniting your passion for life. Because I think sometimes when, especially if we've had like difficulty in relationships or things that we've been dealing with that have been difficult, we can lose our passion for life. And it's important that we live a life of passion. God wants us to live our lives to the fullest, and he tells us that over and over in the Bible. There on more than one occasion that we're to live our lives to the fullest. And so reigniting our passion is important. And, you know, I've been mentoring a lot of people, and I find that they have lost their passion, and they've lost their passion in life. And so I'm like, okay, well, what brings you life? And so this is an important thing, because we need to be engaged with things that bring us life. Otherwise, we'll just continue to go day by day on this treadmill of life. And we're not necessarily making the impact that God created us to make. So by reigniting our passion, we can make that impact even while we're doing our day-to-day. And so I'm pretty excited about next month. Stay tuned.
For any of you who were at our barbecue last year, it was a ton of fun, and we are doing it again. We plan to do this an annual endeavor, and this year we want to make not just a community barbecue for us to get together and just spend time together and have fun, but we also want to engage in some fundraising events or initiatives there to help raise funds for what we do, all of our mentoring, all of the different services that we offer throughout the year. And so Connie and I will be releasing more information in the coming days, but we wanted to let you guys know the date so you could save it on your calendar. It's August 10th. It'll be all day long. You can come and go as you need or please. And it will be at our home, kind of halfway between Langdon and Strathmore. So save the date. We'd love to have you come, and we'll send out more information in the coming weeks. For anyone who might be watching this, if you are feeling like, you know, you need extra support, or you want someone to journey with you through some of the challenges that you're facing, don't hesitate to reach out to us and book a mentoring session. And you can do that on our website. It's on the main page. You'll see this icon, and you just click the book now button, and it will show different availabilities for when you can schedule a time, and we'd love to connect with you.